if we talk about the word enlightenment, going back thousands of years, the subject was known by some people who awakened and the process became complete, and they felt compelled. It's just something that moves through you, and that knowing is there, that if anyone is interested, to share explanations or descriptions, pointers, guidance. And so going back thousands of years, we can see books that have this information in them, but the language is a bit, well, it's unique, and it's carried over into this time, but then there are other descriptions using different vocabulary that may clarify a few things. So if we look at the traditional relationship to the word enlightenment, people often look at teachers or gurus who have made a mark in history, and in a way there's this assumption that it can't happen to you or me, that if it does happen, it's going to be something so extraordinary that in fact you won't be considered an ordinary human, because this sort of godly event has happened. And that relationship to the word enlightenment already sets up a little bit of a barrier in spiritual seeking. It sets up an expectation that might not be accurate, and lots of other games that the ego can play with this sort of superiority, inferiority. There can be a desire for it to happen, there can be an expectation that it can't happen because I'm not good enough, all sorts of different things. So let's talk about what Buddha said. Enlightenment is the end of suffering. He made it very clear and simple. He didn't phrase it in a positive frame, but rather in a negative way. It's not the gaining of anything, but the absence of something. And if we get rid of any notion of this spiritual word enlightenment and just ask ourselves practically, what is it that we're looking for in life? What is all this seeking about? And we come up with the answer that actually we've always been looking for happiness. Everyone is looking for happiness. And that word happiness is undefined, and people are trying to find it in their own way. People believe that happiness for one person is different to happiness for another. So one person is seeking happiness through fame or fortune, someone else is seeking it through family and friends, someone else through career and money. And if we look at that, the seeking for happiness seems to be an external seeking, a seeking for happiness through the acquisition of things. Happiness is going to come when I get somewhere. Happiness is something to be found out there. Explanations that have been given throughout time is that actually happiness is never to be found outside, but rather it's coming to know yourself. It's about a movement inwards rather than a movement outwards. And in practical terms, if we say, what is my unhappiness in everyday living, because it's very hard to answer what our happiness is when we don't necessarily have a good experience of it. So if we go from that point of view, what's my happiness, I have to take someone else's explanation of what this happiness is. So if we start looking at it for ourselves and we ask, what is my unhappiness in life? When is it that I feel unhappy? We will find that it's when we feel uncomfortable with ourselves, or uncomfortable with the other, and being uncomfortable with the other is actually just an uncomfortableness with oneself, or an uncomfortableness with life, which also is an uncomfortableness with oneself. So we can say that my unhappiness in life is feeling uncomfortable with myself. The sense of feeling uncomfortable with myself can equate to not feeling whole or not feeling complete, and hence there is this automatic assumption that in order to be complete, I need to acquire things. But if we stick with the actual experience and don't go to the next stage of assuming what it is that will fix this, we find that it's an uncomfortableness with oneself, which is my unhappiness. And that uncomfortableness we can call suffering. And that suffering we can explain as energies that arise in daily living and in different forms. So suffering arises in the form of guilt and blame, worry, expectation, and pride. And under each of those headings there are different forms of guilt. So there can be insecurity, lack of self-worth, shame, guilt for one's actions that have hurt someone else. Under blame, we can have resentment, jealousy, hatred, malice. Under pride, it's generally less intense than guilt and blame, but it's based on the same principle, and that principle is that I am the doer of my actions and the other is the doer of their actions. So if we have pride, at some point that pride is going to turn into guilt or blame. But even what seems like a positive feeling of pride is an uncomfortableness with oneself, because it's really not what we are. We aren't the doers. So pride is a form of suffering. And blame, if we go back to blame, blame can be something which seems justifiable in life. If a car stops on a road where it's not meant to stop and we have to slam on the brakes behind this car, naturally we might have these thoughts, you know, what a stupid place to stop. Where did you get your license? Or, you know, that thought process is blame in a subtle form, and then that can become more intense depending on the situation we find ourselves in. If it's a more dramatic situation, then it may not just be light blame, it might turn into heavy hatred. So this unhappiness we have is the arising of suffering in the form of guilt, blame, pride, worry and expectation. So we can now conclude that our happiness is actually not the acquiring of anything, but finding us in a position where suffering doesn't arise when the flow of life delivers pain, which is what has caused suffering to arise in the past. We can call that happiness, which is the absence of suffering, peace of mind. So really enlightenment is an occurrence that happens that after it has happened means the person no longer experiences suffering when life delivers pain. And that we can call continuous, unbroken peace of mind. So enlightenment is simply happiness for the human, and happiness for the human is continuous, unbroken peace of mind. Now, when we're seeking, we're reading lots of books, and certain teachings come from a different point of view. They describe the nature of oneself rather than looking what's in the way. The explanation is to come from the other side and to give descriptions of what oneself is, to try and remind and awaken the awareness or the sense of self to what it really is, instead of it continuing to misidentify itself with something it's not. And when those descriptions are given, words such as awareness, consciousness, openness, bliss, universal love are used, stillness, brilliance, the brightness of a million suns, oneness, end of separation. And at some point along the way, we have experiences that we can call mystical experiences or peak experiences. And those experiences, when they happen, tend to be treated as though they're something very, very significant. They are a sign that the spiritual process is working, that understanding is starting to happen. And that's true. It's not problematic to draw that conclusion as long as we don't hang on to it too strongly, hang on to those ideas too strongly. But what can become problematic is that the nature of those experiences, the nature of those peak experiences, can be so profound and can be so complete and can match so precisely the descriptions that are given in certain books and teachings, that the assumption is that enlightenment is this experience forever. What normally happens is the experience comes, it lasts for a period of time, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 1 day, 2 days, a month, and then it ends. And when it ends, we draw the conclusion, that is what enlightenment is, but at the point when enlightenment really happens, it'll remain like this forever. So the state in which we experience life is going to change dramatically and match these peak experiences. When I went to my teacher, Ramesh, after having a peak experience, and it was a peak experience that was so profound where the sense of subject-object fell away, the sense of being an individual fell away completely, the sense that all there was consciousness, that everything that arose in the moment was made of consciousness, was recognized by consciousness, that the body was not anything to do with what I was, and the I in that moment was a very impersonal sense of I. It was intertwined with the awareness that everything arose in, and it matched perfectly traditional non-Advaitic descriptions of what the true self is. So it made sense that after the experience, which lasted for about 10 minutes, ended, the conclusion was, that was a free sample of enlightenment, and now my job is to make it come back. And when it comes back, it needs to last forever. So, given that this seemed like an extremely significant event, I booked a ticket and went to Mumbai, sat quietly in the satsang until it seemed appropriate to have a discussion with Ramesh, and I described this experience. And as soon as I finished describing it, and I used the words that I thought were most appropriate to try and convey what had happened, and Ramesh looked at me and he said, "Roger, it's just an experience. Don't worry about it." Now this shocked me a little bit, and so I said, well, actually maybe I didn't describe it correctly, and so I changed some words and represented it to him, and I felt, yes, now I've done a good job, so now he'll understand. And he said, "Roger, it's just an experience. Let it go." So I tried explaining it again, different term, the third time. "Roger, it's just an experience. Let it go." So at the end of that, I started questioning. I thought maybe he doesn't know what I've experienced. Like, actually, maybe he hasn't experienced what I've experienced. Maybe his idea of enlightenment is incorrect, is not complete. And that he's talking from a perspective that's not complete. And so I left holding on to that idea, because that is what made most sense to me, because this experience was so profound that I couldn't accept and matched, this is the important thing, it matched the description so closely that I couldn't accept that this wasn't a sample of what enlightenment was. And so for several weeks and even months, I walked around waiting for this to happen again, trying to recreate it. I would walk the same path that I had walked, and as I got to the same point in the walk, I would sort of hope that as I took the step, it would suddenly happen again. And I realized that wanting it to happen, trying to make it happen, being upset that it hasn't happened, was becoming a whole new set of suffering. And as that suffering got greater and greater, his words came back into my mind. "Roger, it's just an experience. Don't worry about it." And I thought, well, actually, have you considered that he could be right? Have you considered that what he's saying is real wisdom coming from an experience of transformation that he's had, and having gone through the same mistakes that I might have gone through? And in that moment, I realized that actually the suffering that was building up here was because I wasn't accepting that it's just an experience, let it go. And that recognition was enough for me to at least try to open my mind up to it being something different to what I was concluding. So I went back over CDs and talks that I had, and his description of enlightenment started to stand out more and more, that enlightenment is simply the end of suffering. Enlightenment for the human being is happiness, and happiness for the human being is continuous, unbroken peace of mind, regardless of circumstance. So then I thought, well, it doesn't mean that, because in that experience there was no way that suffering could arise. There was no entity that could suffer. There was nothing that could happen in that moment. The thought even arose, someone can come and chop my arms off, and it would have nothing to do with what I am or who I am. So then, going back to the description that enlightenment is simply unbroken peace of mind, I concluded maybe it doesn't have to come in the form of this profound experience. Maybe I can still have the experience of being an individual entity and have this unbroken peace of mind. And so with more and more thinking, it became apparent that what may be the case is that we continue to have the experience of being a separate entity, and that experience is not going to end, but with a knowing that comes from various insights and experiences, a knowing that actually what we really are is not a separate entity, but that source in which everything arises, of which everything is made, and from which everything is recognized. And in the peak experience, that was shown experientially. But the benefit of the experience was not for it to be there forever, but rather for conclusions to be drawn that can then be attributed to daily living. And that is the knowing that what we really are is awareness, what we really are is unaffected by the flow of life, what we really are is not time-bound, not changing, what we really are is something that is constant. But the experience of daily life is going to be one of being a separate individual, sitting in a chair, talking to other individuals, with the understanding that comes as part of the spiritual process and is a cumulative process that at some point culminates in an understanding that at the time may not even be recognized. It's not an understanding that we can see and say, this is my understanding, I have a total understanding. Actually, we can conclude that we have a total understanding, which is not my understanding, but rather something that has happened in the flow of life because of one's destiny. We conclude that there is a total understanding because we look back over a period of time, 1 month, 6 months, and we realize actually life has been happening, good things happening, bad things happening, pleasure happening, pain happening. The pleasure was experienced and let go of, the pain was experienced and let go of, and all along suffering hasn't arisen. So it's actually something that we can wake up to in hindsight and say, wow, the understanding must be total because suffering is not arising in the way it used to before. Could it be that this process is actually that simple, that subtle, and not necessarily what we've assumed it to be, where one day lightning is going to strike and bells are going to start ringing, angels come down from heaven, maybe the body dissolve into, universal consciousness. And so having said that, in a way we're demystifying it, but life can never really be demystified. This process can never be demystified because what life is actually is totally mystical. So it can never be demystified, but hopefully what we can do is get rid of some of the confusion that arises when we have descriptions or ideas about things that are not necessarily that accurate. And so with that understanding, with the knowing that what we really are is consciousness, that the essence of this human being is impersonal consciousness, that when the body dies, impersonal consciousness will return to where it came from, and actually while the body is alive, that impersonal consciousness is not disconnected from where it has actually come from. So with the understanding that what I am is a three-dimensional human biological instrument to which universal consciousness has identified and is functioning through as personal consciousness, with that understanding, from time to time when there's nothing to do in the flow of life and one sits back and relaxes, the consciousness which is centralized in the body can expand, and in that moment there is the experiential recognition that yes, what is the root of my being is impersonal consciousness. And then if something requires attention, that expanded consciousness can seem to contract a little bit into the body, but the contraction now is not such that it becomes problematic. The understanding is still there, but throughout the day, the consciousness can expand and contract. Even what is being called contracted now is significantly more expanded than the contraction that was there when there was the misunderstanding of what I am. So, relatively speaking, the contracted sense of I that functions through the body when action is required is still significantly more expanded than the contracted I when there is the belief that I am an individual human being with volition and not connected to anything. But it can be quite subtle, especially when the contrast of the old sense of me falls away. Then what's left seems to become so normal. It loses its sense of extraordinariness. And so you carry on living your life as the individual, with different states of consciousness happening throughout the day, peak experiences happening from time to time, but none of that is what's important. The expanded state of consciousness is not any different to the state of consciousness which is centralized in the body. Peak experiences are actually seen to be pleasure, peak pleasures or mystical pleasures, and that is not what is important. What's important is the underlying sense of peace of mind that remains unbroken. And what we're looking for is something that remains constant. So to focus on aspects of the self that come and go, like bliss or love, can create some confusion, because it can create the idea that this will remain constant when the nature of it is actually not to remain constant but to come and go. And if we then identify correctly with what stays, which is peace of mind, then our search can become much more focused. What it is what I'm looking for is not a state of being in love with everyone, being in love with everything. It's actually a state of living life for the rest of my life as a human being with continuous, unbroken peace of mind, which is not something I do, but something that now happens spontaneously because of the recognition of what my essence is. And that recognition is actually simply the absence of the ideas that previously obscured what is always and has always been there. And that's why this is possible. This state is possible to be there because of what our true nature is. If our true nature was not awareness or consciousness, which is not part of the flow of life, which is not affected by the comings and goings of life, not affected by pleasure and pain, then we would be doomed to be in the flow of life. Because our true nature is what it is awareness, is the very thing in which everything arises, is the very thing in which everything is made of, which therefore means nothing is separate from it, nothing can attack it, nothing can diminish it, nothing can cut it in half. Because that's our nature, continuous, unbroken peace of mind can function. And then we recognize that that peace of mind is not peace of mind for the individual. It is the very nature, which is the absence of the very notion of suffering. That's all that peace of mind is. It's the absence of the notion of suffering, because our nature is incapable of suffering because there's nothing to attack it. And then naturally we find that love is there. And we don't need to define that love, we don't need to try and create it, we don't need to try and aim for it. It will be there because it is an aspect of what we are. One thing we spoke about previously is the difference between involvement and witnessing. Involvement is what happens when we are convinced that our happiness is to be found in pleasure. And witnessing is what happens when pleasure and pain are seen to be two ends of the spectrum of the flow of life that are inevitably going to come and go, pleasure sometimes, pain other times, and a continuous falling away of one and the arising of another. And witnessing happens when that is understood and life is allowed to flow without us getting in the way of it, without us resisting what happens. So involvement is being attached to outcomes. Witnessing is being unattached to outcomes. And so when witnessing happens, and witnessing by its very nature is to just watch. Awareness, which we've been told time and time again is what our true nature is. Consciousness is all there is. Consciousness is what we are. And the words awareness and consciousness are interchangeable. In some teachings, awareness is the word used for the ultimate, and consciousness is used for what functions through the individual. In other teachings, awareness is that which functions through the individual, and consciousness is the ultimate. So in this description, we can use awareness and consciousness as more or less interchangeable for the time being. So awareness, just the word awareness suggests, it doesn't suggest doing, it doesn't suggest thinking. So if our nature is awareness, it really means to be aware, to watch, to recognize. And witnessing, we can then conclude, is what happens when awareness is functioning in its uninvolved nature. So awareness, whether we recognize it or not, is always functioning. Awareness is the very thing that allows us to see trees and birds. Awareness is what allows us to recognize thoughts and feel emotions. When that awareness is accompanied by the sense of personal doership, by the belief that it is I, the body, that has created this awareness or this function, this consciousness, when that belief is there, then awareness isn't aware of itself, but rather just aware of objects. And the awareness is taken for granted, in a sense, never recognized, but it's always functioning. And that's why when there is this awakening experience, awareness becomes aware of itself, and there is this recognition, this has always been here. This will never go anywhere. It's the basis of daily living. Without awareness, daily living wouldn't happen. Without awareness, we would be in a state of deep sleep. Awakening is simply awareness that is always functioning, waking up to the fact that it is actually there, waking up to the fact that it is the background, it is the basis in which everything arises. So going back to witnessing is the function of awareness in its uninvolved state. So when awareness has woken up to itself and the idea I am this body has fallen away, awareness functions as the witness, or as witnessing. No entity that is doing the witnessing, just witnessing. Witnessing is watching without involvement, watching without resistance, watching without judgment, watching without trying to change what is happening, accepting everything as a happening, as an experience in the moment. In the absence of all thought, what's left is this space with the sense of I am, the sense of existence, in which everything arises. And if that's our nature, then we don't need to think I am this. There is the state of being. And in that state of being, we are. We are what we are. I am that I am. No question arising, what am I? No answer required. We are just in a state of being. When we open our eyes, that state of being is flooded by all of these images. But what was there with our eyes closed is still here in this moment. It's still the background of this present experience. The sights that flood, the images that flood, can tend to distract, which is why awareness has forgotten about itself, or that awareness is not there. But regardless of the fact that the images distract, it's still there in the background, just like the screen at the cinema. The images are projected onto the screen, but the screen actually never changes. The screen is unaffected. And so awareness is the background of every experience, even dream state. And so this is not just conceptual, this is something that if we're quiet, if we don't ask, what am I, if we don't go and look for answers somewhere, if we don't wait for answers to come to us, that's what's there. It's very it doesn't happen easily because the mind is so used to moving all the time, looking for an answer, projecting outwards as to what it thinks it is and what it thinks it needs. But if we find ourselves able to settle, if the mind settles and doesn't ask any questions, there is just a state of being, and in that state of being, experientially, there is awareness. And in that moment, we recognize all of the images, all of the sounds, all of the objects, all of the thoughts, all of the emotions. The belief that I am this or I am that, I am good, I am bad. It becomes recognized that any object that arises within this awareness. If you take the awareness away, the object would collapse. So the object and the awareness are actually not separate, they're interdependent. And if they are interdependent and everything arises in awareness or consciousness, we can then say that everything is made of awareness or consciousness. That what we think is solid is not actually solid, but is an experience of being solid. And that experience is an experience within awareness, made of awareness, and recognized by awareness. So all there is awareness, or all there is consciousness. Everything is consciousness. Now, how do we explain that theoretically into a framework that makes sense to us? So if we take the example of our dream at night, and we assume for a moment that Roger 40 is a real separate entity, and that when he goes to bed at night, he can dream, or he does dream, and that he is the creator of his dream. When Roger 40 goes to sleep and dreams about a beach scenario, and Roger 25 becomes the main character in that dream. That dream is happening in the mind of Roger 40 who is sleeping. Whatever happens in the dream only happens because Roger 40's consciousness or Roger 40's mind is thinking it into existence. From within the dream, Roger 25 will feel himself to be real, made of flesh, with blood running through him, will feel the sand to be separate from him, will feel the ocean to be separate and have a different sensation to sand. He will seemingly have senses, eyes, ears, nose, and from within the dream, the assumption is I am real, I am separate from everything else that happens in the dream. And everything is made of its own unique stuff. The sand is made of sand stuff, the water is made of water stuff, and I am made of Roger stuff. From outside of the dream, we realize that the conclusions made within the dream are conclusions that have been included in the dream. Roger 25 cannot conclude anything. Roger 25 can't think anything without it being part of the dream. Roger 25 is actually not separate from the water or the sand. He's not separate from the mind of Roger 40. Everything is contained within the mind of Roger 40 and made of Roger 40 mind stuff. The way that the dream unfolds, Roger 25 getting up and walking to the ocean, diving in, feeling the sensation of the water on his face, feeling the sun on his skin, other people getting up and going to buy drinks and walking towards the ocean. All of that is happening exactly as Roger 40's consciousness or mind is creating it to happen. The 100 people on the beach in the dream are not actually separate, independent people in control of their actions. They're all doing exactly what Roger 40's mind is creating them to do. They may well have the thoughts arising if Roger 25 was to go up and ask them, "Are you real?" They might have the thought, "Of course I'm real," but that thought is part of the dream as created by Roger 40. So if we consider the notion, and this is what mystics have been telling us for thousands of years, this is what we get to experience for ourselves within certain peak experiences, This is what becomes the only viable explanation. In fact, every other explanation gets shown to be totally incorrect. And this is what's left as we go through the process of coming to understand ourselves. We come to see that what this is a dream within a universal mind, and what mind is made of is consciousness, so we can say a dream within a universal consciousness, unfolding exactly as it has been created to unfold, arising within the universal consciousness, made of universal consciousness, and recognized by universal consciousness. In the dream, the consciousness or awareness that functions through Roger 25 is actually the consciousness of Roger 40, assuming that Roger 40 is a separate, independent being, not part of a dream. But now we come to see, with this explanation, that actually Roger 40 is in himself just an object in a dream. And so when he goes to sleep, it's just a dream within a dream. So Roger 25 is a dream character within another dream. And so if we now say that Roger 40 is a dream character, where does the consciousness that is functioning through Roger 40 come from? Where is the consciousness, if Sunshine is a character, where is the consciousness that functions through Sunshine coming from? So this consciousness that is functioning through Roger 40 and through Sunshine, on the basis that the consciousness functioning through Roger 25 in the dream is actually the consciousness of Roger 40 who is sleeping, then we would say that the consciousness functioning through Roger 40 here is actually the consciousness of the universal mind that is creating the dream. And the consciousness functioning through Sunshine is also the consciousness of the universal mind which is creating the dream. So what is functioning through Sunshine is not different to what is functioning through Roger. You and I are one in the same consciousness. But as we know, the individual bodies have their own genes and conditioning. They're differentiated from each other with unique genetic code, personality types, different conditioning. And therefore, the expression through each of the body, even though it is the one universal consciousness, the expression is unique through each of the different human beings. From the perspective of you and I within the dream, so from your perspective and my perspective, whatever is happening moment to moment is not my will. I am not creating what happens moment to moment, and you're not creating what happens moment to moment. We go through life believing that actually I am in control, and I must make things happen, and you're in control, and you must do good things to me, I must do good things to you. If you do bad things to me, then I hate you. That's how we go through life. If we start to see life as a dream, we say everything that happens is God's will. God is making it happen, not you or me. We are just the objects through which what God has created is happening. We are part of what God has created. So thy will be done, not my will. And so what we're saying is that from the perspective of you and I within the dream, at first we will say that it's God's will, so we are separate from God, and God is separate from what's happening. As our understanding changes, we come with this explanation and then a viewing of life. We say, actually, there is no separate me from the other, and there is no separate God from me. That everything is a spontaneous happening in the moment, that cause and effect is something that happens within the dream only. It's how the dream has been designed to be experienced and how the dream has been designed to unfold. So at first, when we're still feeling separate and considering, is it all a dream, we start off saying it's God's will. Then as we look at it more and more, we realize actually there is no separate God from what's happening now. And so the idea that there is a God controlling falls away. And So we start off with dualistic language, and then the understanding negates the dualism within the language. So the dualistic language can start off being useful, and then the understanding makes everything clear. So if it's all a dream, you are not the doer. I am not the doer. You are not the creator. I am not the creator. It is not your will or my will, but God's will. So for you to want to find an answer about what you can do to stop or start something is to not recognize that actually our life is destined to unfold exactly as it unfolds, and then to continue to create suffering by looking for an answer that will never be found. The answer is, you are not the doer, I am not the doer, so there is nothing we can do. However, the dream does continue to unfold moment to moment, and the way it's been designed, cause and effect, means that if we have this discussion that is pointing out, you are not the doer, I am not the doer, it could well be that that is part of the conditioning in the moment that changes Nuriya, because we are always being reconditioned, changes her in such a way that in the future suffering doesn't arise. And if suffering doesn't arise in the future, it's because the dream has determined that at this point, new conditioning is happening, and because new conditioning has happened, that suffering in the future doesn't make sense to be included in the dream. So it's impersonal. It's like life is shaping us moment to moment, just like the river is shaping the pebble, and we don't know how we're going to be shaped. But given that you find yourself in a discussion like this, is positive. The nature of this dream is that once the false conditioning about who we are is removed, and that's all this new conditioning is. This new conditioning is not to be taken on as new ideas to hold on to. They are just ideas that attack the old conditioning, and once the old conditioning is attacked, it falls away, and then even these new ideas fall away. So Ramana Maharshi said, in relation to spiritual concepts, use this thorn to remove the thorn that is embedded in your hand, but then remember to throw both thorns away. And the reason that we don't need a concept of everything being predetermined, that what we are is awareness, once the change has happened, is because this is how it is, and so we don't need to think it, it just is. The reason that we feel disconnected from ourselves, that we ask the question, who am I, is because the truth is always there, what we are is always there. But what we have are these false ideas that are covering it up. So the process is simply about getting rid of the false ideas, pointing out concepts that we hold as truths, and when they are seen to be false, they fall away. And when they fall away, what has always been there is left behind.